Okay, a couple things before looking back at spring scales. First one, the first midterm exam is this coming Monday, so a couple days from now. In class 1 to 150, and it's 30 multiple choice questions. This has been my standard for the past 5 or so years. So 30 multiple choice questions. It will cover material through Friday. So today we'll get hopefully pretty far into bouncing balls, and we might get a little bit into the life on a carousel, and probably not roller coasters, but that's the idea. So that's where it will stop. The content that I expect you to be responsible for will stop a little bit into carousels and roller coasters. How to study for this exam. The questions that I ask will be similar to those on the problem sets. They'll be one-off questions, not a series of questions, because they'll appear on your personal exam booklet in a random order. So they have to be just independent questions. There are lots of old exams on the website. They're in the section, the tab marked resources. There are exams going back probably about 2010, give or take, and actually they go back way before that if you start digging into that website. You'll see, I encourage you to take old midterm ones. If you go back far enough, you'll find that I had only one midterm somewhat later in the semester, and it had 40 questions instead of 30. In any case, when you look at these midterms, be aware that occasionally I'm in slightly different places in the semester, in the content at the time I give the exam, and so you may see questions about bicycles or something like that, which we haven't come to. Some of the stuff about riding a roller coaster we won't have come to either. So a few questions you'll go like, what's this? And you can skip those. But anyway, take the old exams. There's nothing like having to suffer over the question to sort of get you thinking about it. Looking at the old exam answers, which are also there, is not the same experience. That's nearly useless. So I encourage you to take them. They are set up so that from a virginia.edu IP address, it's easy to get into them. If you go off grounds and want to see them, let's see. Yeah, so take the old exams. Any questions about the midterm? It will involve a bubble sheet, so bring a pencil. I'll be scanning them myself, so you actually can use a pen this go around. Historically, a pen didn't read, but it'll read this go around. So that's the exam. Second thing, the problem set, the third problem set, which is due this Friday, so 2 days from now. It's on this new website that I brought to life. Do try to log in before it gets too far along. Make sure that you can get access. I sent you all emails. You should have got an email that will take you there with a temporary password. If you can't find the email, it looks like you can go to that website. It's linked to the homepage for this class, my version of this class website. Come over here. This is what I consider the class website. If you go down here where it says homework site, and it's Robbie 2, physics, whatever, if you click on that, there's our class, the new homework site for it. If you don't know your username and password, your username is just your computing ID. I'm LAB3E. So there's a section, forgot your username and password. You should be able to, with that, oh, and the email address, it knows your virginia.edu email address. With those, you should be able to get it to email you a temporary password and get in. Is that okay? Hopefully I won't have to field too many desperate, I've got 30 seconds. Tell me where. Okay. Last thing. My office hours are normally Monday afternoons, but since the exam is at 1 o'clock, I expect a lot of you will be like, walk out the door and not want to think about physics for the afternoon. So what I think I'll do this coming Monday only, I'll pull my office hours into the morning. So 9 to 11, I'll plan to be in Alderman Cafe to talk about stuff. So if you're looking for help studying for the exam or thinking about the exam, come and find me. Monday. Any other questions? All right. So, spring scales. The basic idea behind a spring scale at this point, I've said it now just to try to summarize it, is that if you support an object using a spring, so you take the spring that was sitting there at its favorite shape and length and everything like that, its equilibrium, its own personal equilibrium shape and length, and you make it support the weight of the object you're trying to weigh. The spring will distort in order to summon up the force it needs to support the weight that you've plopped on it. So right now, the spring is at its own equilibrium shape. There is a spring hiding inside this scale. And when I put the weight on it, the spring gets distorted, it bends downward, and as it does, it begins to exert a restoring force on its own pieces. And the restoring force is proportional to how far it's been distorted. And that observation that the restoring force is proportional to the distortion is called Hooke's law. It's sitting up there on the screen. It's just a remarkably universal law. So many things in our world, if you bend them away from their favorite shape, they begin to push back. And how hard do they push back? With a force that's proportional to how far you take them away. A tree does this. A bridge does this. The steps at a step class do this. So I've asked questions you'll see on the old exams where probably, whenever someone's standing still on the step at a step class, exercise class, the step is bent down a little bit. And in principle, if you saw how far it bent down, you would know how much the person weighs. All right, now you can be paranoid next time you go to a step class. Anyhow, so the spring bends down. And if you can figure out how far the spring bent down in order to support the weight that it's holding up, you know how much force it's exerting on the thing to hold it up. So the full logical story of what's being measured versus what the weight of the object is this. This weight is being pulled down by gravity with a force that's associated with how much there is there. It happens to be 49 newtons. The weight of this little guy is 49 newtons. So what's going on here? The scale is pushing up with a force of 49 newtons. How do we know that? Because the weight isn't accelerating. Evidently, the two forces cancel. The support from the scale and gravity down, they sum to zero. Everybody okay with that idea? Questions about that idea? So the spring scale and the spring basically is pushing up with 49 newtons of force right now. How does it know to point at 49 newtons? Well, what the scale's got inside is some gears and pieces that are measuring how far the spring has distorted downward. And it's been set up, it has been calibrated so that when the spring distorts the amount it's currently distorted, the dial has moved and is pointing at 49 to tell you, I'm pushing up with 49 newtons of force. Is that okay? Of course, that's all the scale knows, is that it is pushing up with 49 newtons of force. It doesn't know what's above it. It happens in this case to be a block that weighs 49 newtons, but it could be just me. This is the same situation as far as the scale is concerned. It can't tell the difference. I don't weigh 49 newtons. I just happen to be arranging my force on it to be 49 newtons, and my fingers are wearing out. Okay? So the scale only reports the correct weight of an object in a sort of a special circumstance, when the thing that's sitting on it is otherwise unsupported, so the scale is completely responsible for holding it up, and the thing on the scale is not accelerating and is therefore at equilibrium. So that block's at equilibrium, it's not accelerating, and so the scale must be supporting it perfectly. Therefore, whatever the scale tells you in terms of how hard it's pushing up, that must be the same as the weight of the block. Questions about the whole idea of weighing then on a spring scale? This leaves then, so what do some springs look like for spring scales? In here, if you cut this thing open, you would find the spring there, you would find a rack and pinion system where there's sort of teeth in a stick that turn a little pinion gear and make it rotate and move the dial. So as the spring comes down, and during the weighing process, this platform does go down because it's attached to the spring. The spring is stretching or compressing, and the little rack and pinion system is turning the dial. All right? You're used to electronics scales, and the electronic scale, so this is what I just want to show you. Wake up here. I'll show you the electronic weighing devices. They're still springs. The only difference is, instead of a rack and pinion moving a dial, there's some electrical thing changing as the spring is bending. And I'll show you a couple of, oh yes, how do we do this? Oh yeah. Ta-da! And, nothing. The document camera, it says, oh, is it on? Wake up. Blink, blink, blink. I don't know what it's doing here. You can push all the buttons, it's lamp. Oh. I'll give it another few seconds and then I'll get bored and do something different. Is it there? And? Yay! All right. This is, oh, and lights and everything. Yeah. So this is, these are known as load cells. This is actually a spring. You fix this one to the table so it can't move, and you put weights on this one. And believe it or not, this whole structure, even though it's made of aluminum, bends a little. You can't see it here. The movements are infinitesimally small, but electronically, there's stuff in here that measures the flexure of this structure and reports back how far it's bent. So it obeys Hooke's law beautifully. So this is a big one. Here's a little teeny one, right? It has to talk in a high voice. So they're just for measuring different amounts of weight. Same idea. And here's a more high-tech version of a related thing. This can measure weights in a millionth of a second. This is a really high-speed one. Anyhow, these are the kind of structures that are hiding inside the scale at a grocery store or inside the bathroom scale or whatever you want. It's still a spring. It doesn't look very spring-like, but it's still, if I were super strong here, I could bend this sucker, and you'd see it's a spring, just one that reports its distortion electronically. Okay? And go back. Yay. All right, so that's the world of springs, for spring scales, for sensors for springs. Last topic to talk about, and that is what happens, I guess I can start over here. What happens if you violate the rules of weighing something and the object you're weighing isn't at equilibrium and motionless, right? To weigh this thing, according to the rules, this force that the spring scale exerts upward only matches the weight of the object downward if they sum to 0 and the thing isn't accelerating. It's at equilibrium. If it's not at equilibrium, if it's accelerating, the force up from the scale and the object's weight don't match. So what the scale is telling you and the object's weight, they're not related very well. Did that get across? Questions about that idea? If you're jumping up and down on the scale such that you are accelerating, what the scale reads and your weight, they're not the same. And this is I mean, it's an experience that you guys essentially can't do anymore. The scales are so automated and techy. But I told you last time, as a kid, this is the kind of scale that I grew up with. And you could jump up and down on them, and the dial would be going back and forth, correctly reporting the force it's exerting upward on you, but that's not your weight. All right? So when it's out of equilibrium, it's reading more than your weight, less than your weight, all over the place. And you end up with this motion, which is, I talked about as the negotiation between the wagon on the sidewalk. Here it's the negotiation between the block and the scale as it's trying to figure out just how hard to push on you to get you to equilibrium and sit there. That bouncing process. Let's look at the bouncing process carefully. The problem set drags you through it also. So this is directly related to the problem set. It's also one of the most important types of motion in physics. For physicists, this is like a central issue. For ordinary people, well, it will turn out to be important whether you like it or not. It's the basis for most clocks, this kind of motion. It's the basis for virtually all musical instruments. So to talk about how a violin string vibrates, or the air inside of a flute, how that works, it's all the same motion. It's all spring-like systems that are driving something back and forth through equilibrium. So let me talk about this for a second. And, I can put the appropriate view graph here. This motion, the motion about the equilibrium that shows up, it shows up in the problem set when you bungee jump. You can call it a bunch of different things. In some contexts, it's called a vibration. In others, it's called an oscillation. Doesn't matter. It's the same thing. This little chunk of brass, this brass cylinder, is hanging from a very thin spring that you may well not be able to see. And I can probably, let's see whether I can do this. Bring that camera. Ooh, we're moving. I overshot. Zoom in. Ooh. This is all updated since the last time I went driving. Oops. There we go. Okay. So you can see there's a thin, I hope, a thin spring holding up that brass cylinder. And right now the brass cylinder is at equilibrium. So if I knew the behavior of this spring and I knew what its own equilibrium length is almost nothing. So I've stretched it a lot in order to summon up enough restoring force from it to support that cylinder. So if I knew the characteristics of the spring and how far I stretched it, I could tell you how much that cylinder weighs. And that's the story I just finished. But what happens if I take the cylinder away from equilibrium and let go? It doesn't matter whether I go up above or down below. The result's going to be the same. It's going to bounce back and forth. So this is the famous oscillation. It's going back and forth around equilibrium. Whenever so now let me walk you through it. So here's equilibrium. If I force it to go below equilibrium, I have overstretched the spring. The spring is now pulling up with a force bigger than the cylinder's weight. And that by itself means that the force is back toward equilibrium. It's going to accelerate upward. when I let go of it. Can you follow that idea? I stretch the spring extra much. It's pulling up harder now than gravity's pulling down the cylinder. My hand is gumming things up for the minute, but when I let go, whoa, it accelerates up. You understand why it accelerated up? Okay. If I go above equilibrium, the spring is understretched. It's not pulling up very hard anymore. So the weight down is big, the pull up from the spring is little. The cylinder is under supported. It's going to accelerate downward when I let go of it, like this. Woo, downward it goes. You know, the downward, because it's an acceleration, you got to watch for a little while, and you got to see, oh, it's going faster and faster in the downward direction. So first observation, or just to number them for no reason. Whenever the cylinder is above the equilibrium and nothing else is around, like me, it's going to accelerate down. You okay with that, or questions about why that happened? I know we've gotten out of the habit of having a conversation here. I'm talking myself. All right? Whenever it's below equilibrium, it's pulled up extra hard, and it's going to accelerate upward when I get out of the story. So that's just a general theme, that the acceleration is always back towards equilibrium. That doesn't mean that the cylinder is moving towards equilibrium, because that's a velocity story. And its velocity depends on what it was doing a moment ago, not on the forces. The forces affect it. But if I throw the cylinder across the room, yeah, it'll be accelerating towards equilibrium, but it would also be moving across the room. Okay, so if I start with the cylinder way up high, barely supported at all, and I let go, it's going to start the story, this story, by accelerating towards equilibrium. It'll begin to head downward. I'm going to do it like human animation, then I'll actually let it go. So pretend my hand isn't here, it's just making life go slow here. So when I let go, it's going to accelerate downward and begin to move downward. So it will start with no velocity, but it'll quickly acquire a downward velocity, go faster and faster, because it's accelerating downward. And it will reach equilibrium pretty soon, going quite fast. And why quite fast? Because it has been accelerating downward and moving downward. That means it's speeding up. When it gets to equilibrium, suddenly it will be perfectly supported. That's what equilibrium means, no net force. And it will stop accelerating downward. That's the first moment when it's not accelerating downward anymore. Up to that point, it has been accelerating downward and therefore going faster and faster. Right at equilibrium, we're done. It's reached peak speed. After that, it will go right through equilibrium. And why will it go right through equilibrium? Why doesn't it stop suddenly at equilibrium? You tell me, okay? We'll have you be a little interactive here. Why doesn't it stop? What keeps it going? Inertia, which hopefully now you can look back and see, yeah, inertia was this tendency of objects to keep doing what they're doing. Secretly, behind the whole concept of inertia is the conservation of momentum. Once you got momentum, you can't stop, you can't stop. You got to keep going unless something takes your momentum away. So the same thing, whether you think of it as inertia keeping it going through equilibrium or momentum downward keeping it going through equilibrium, it's the same idea. So it goes right through equilibrium. And once it's done that, it's overstretched the spring. And the spring is pulling up harder now than its own weight is pulling it downward. So on the way down from way up high, the acceleration was downward and the velocity was downward, both downward. And then we get to equilibrium and the acceleration vanishes, and this hand is doing stupid stuff that has forget it. Once you go through equilibrium, the acceleration's upward now, and the cylinder is moving downward, but it's slowing down because it's accelerating the wrong way. It's accelerating in the direction opposite its own velocity. So it slows down slower, until finally it comes completely to rest motionless for an instant, but it's still accelerating upward. So it doesn't stay down there. It begins to come back up. It's accelerating upward, and now it's speeding up. So it speeds up, it coasts through equilibrium, it slows down, comes to momentarily to rest, and then it begins to descend faster and faster and faster, coasts through equilibrium, and then slows down, and then speeds up, coasts through equilibrium again. It keeps trying to settle at equilibrium, but it keeps shooting right through at high speed. And that's, okay, now I can let it go. That's what it's doing. It's going from motionless, speeding up, slowing down. You know, it's a little too fast for me to talk. I can't talk that fast. I talk fast, but not that fast. So every time it's moving toward equilibrium, it's speeding up. It reaches peak speed right at equilibrium, and then beyond equilibrium, it slows to a stop. And then it does the entire process back the other way. It's just endlessly seeking the equilibrium, but it can't stop. Yeah? In a vacuum, would this happen forever? Pretty nearly. In that context, then, the only way in which this motion back and forth has to keep going because of a second conserved quantity. Well, a conserved quantity. Energy. It's got trapped energy. It can't get rid of the energy. This guy won't move. So between the spring and the bouncing cylinder, they've got energy and nowhere to put it. So if you get rid of air, then this thing is moving through nothing. Air resistance is important for this. It is gradually sucking the energy out and turning it into thermal energy. But once you got rid of the air resistance, the only thing really left is the spring itself. Springs aren't quite perfect. They're really close. So that thing would bob up and down thousands of times before settling noticeably. But springs aren't perfect. Is that okay? You have noticed things that do this motion for a very long time, having a terrible trouble getting rid of the energy that keeps them moving. And all the musical instruments, if you pluck, particularly, not all the musical instruments, some musical instruments, they lose their energy quickly. The head of a drum, whoa, whoa, and it stops. And that's partly why you get the sound that comes out of most drums is not, doesn't have a very clear tone to it. But do I have anything here that will play musical instruments? Yeah, sure. You never thought of a baseball bat as a musical instrument, did you? Can you hear the tone? Yeah, this is in some ways getting ahead of myself. If I hit it right at the red stripe, there's no tone for good reason. That's the place where you cannot play. This is behaving like a xylophone tine. Somebody in your family or friends had like the Fisher-Price xylophone with the little colored rectangles of metal, and you ding, 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 all that stuff, right? And each of those little bars was supported at two special spots that Fisher-Price could not choose. They had to be supported there and not elsewhere. This, amazingly enough, is like one of those xylophone tines, and that's one of the spots you can support it at. It's a special spot at which not only can you support it, but you can't play it there either. So I had to remember, oh yeah, play it elsewhere. Anyway, you could hear the tone coming out of it. What you're hearing is it vibrating back and forth in the same physics as this, endlessly trying to settle at equilibrium shape and endlessly overshooting. And the fact that there was a clear tone, it's not the world's best musical instrument. It was never designed to be that. But the fact that it's got a clear tone means that it made a lot of motion. It went through this a lot of times before it settled. So maybe it went 100 or 200 times before settling. It's not as good as that, but there are structures you can make that will go thousands or tens of thousands of times before they settle down. Other questions? Why is energy keeping this going? If you look at, and so I'll walk all over this problem, the bouncing cylinder, as it bounces, the force that pushes it back towards equilibrium gets stronger the farther it goes away from equilibrium. Because right at equilibrium, its weight downward and the spring force upward perfectly cancel. There's no net force on it. But if you overstretch the spring, it's pulling up harder than the weight, and there's a net force upward back towards equilibrium. And that net force gets bigger and bigger and bigger as the mismatch gets worse. That's followable? It works in the other way too. So the farther you are from equilibrium, the stronger the net force is on the cylinder. Having said that, where in the bounce do you think the upward acceleration of the cylinder is largest? How many think it's at equilibrium? What's the net force at equilibrium? 0. What's the acceleration at equilibrium? Okay. How many think that it's the bottom of the bounce? Okay. Of the two. That's the right answer, okay? Yes, it's the bottom of the bounce. At equilibrium, there's no acceleration. At the bottom of the bounce, that's the place where the cylinder is as far as it'll ever get from equilibrium, and therefore, it's the mismatch between its weight downward and the huge upward force from the spring. The mismatch is the worst, and it's accelerating upward the hardest. Is that we're okay with that, or questions about that? So the peak upward acceleration is when you're at the bottom of the bounce. Where do you think the peak downward acceleration is going to be? Top of the bounce. What about the middle? Is there anything special about the middle, the equilibrium? Yeah, acceleration there is 0, but the velocity is the greatest. It's traveling the fastest. On its way downward, it has been picking up speed the whole time it has been approaching equilibrium, because it's being pulled toward equilibrium, which is below it, and it's moving downward. So its velocity is downward, and it's accelerating downward. So it picks up speed. It hits equilibrium. Right at equilibrium, it's going the fastest it'll ever go. And the same is true on the way up. As it heads upward, it's being pushed back towards equilibrium, and it is moving upward on the way up. It's moving upward and accelerating upward. It's picking up speed, and it hits peak speed right at equilibrium, after which it slows down. So peak speed, so this motion goes from, it hits peak speed every time you hit equilibrium, and peak acceleration at the two ends. Well, my purpose in going through all that is really to look at energy. This sucker hits peak kinetic energy, that is the energy associated with motion, every time it goes through equilibrium. That's when it's traveling fastest. And energy and speed go together, they're buddies. Okay? So kinetic energy and speed go together. It happens that kinetic energy is proportional to speed squared, but that's not crucial here. What about at the ends? At the ends of the bounce, the energy is in potential form. It's stored in the spring, which is, remember, potential energies are energy stored in forces. It's stored in the spring, and gravity is involved in this in a way that it's really not so important. It just shifts the equilibrium, gravity does. The motion is, mostly the energy is stored in the spring. You can really think of it as stored in the spring. And when you're at equilibrium, there's no energy stored in the spring, none available. But anytime it's above or below equilibrium, the spring has got energy in it as potential. So the energy is going from potential to kinetic to potential to kinetic. You know, potential, kinetic, potential, kinetic. I can't go that fast. Do you remember the swinging bowling ball? It's the same story, and I was going, the energy is, it's kinetic, potential, kinetic, potential, kinetic, potential. It's the same motion. Same thing here. It's going, it's potential, kinetic, potential, kinetic, potential, kinetic, potential, kinetic. Anyway, it goes. And the energy is going back and forth. And if you could suck the energy out somehow, it would just have to settle at equilibrium. It wouldn't have any energy be kinetic energy, so it couldn't move. And it wouldn't have any energy be potential energy, so it had to be at equilibrium. Everything's good. And so the energy is gradually being sucked out of this by whatever processes can get their act together and do it. Air resistance, misbehavior in the spring, bending of this post, and will eventually bring this to rest and suck the energy out of it. Yeah? I was good all up until the last thing he said, that it's got trapped energy, and it can't settle at equilibrium until it gets rid of that energy. So what the objects around it do matter in terms of allowing it to settle. If I make the spring go through my hand, and by friction, I was using friction, and I let it give me the energy, it settled. Is this helping, or is this addressing the issue you're looking at? Yeah, so the environment matters a lot. And an example, to get ahead of ourselves, think of pendulum clocks, which there are a lot of phony pendulum clocks around, but there are a few real ones. The famous, old grandfather clocks, there'd be this pendulum going back and forth. If you ever notice those pendulum clocks, the pendulum, the thing swinging back and forth, is not like my bowling ball. It's not a full sphere. It's a disc. Why the disc? Because it has to slice through the air better than a sphere can. The sphere gets too much air resistance. So you flatten the baby out so that it's a knife and cuts through. Yeah, I flatten the baby out. This is a bad idea. Okay. So it swings back. It cuts nicely through the air and experiences less air resistance. That allows it to swing more smoothly and for longer. This will be relevant with musical instruments too. A musical instrument that loses energy too fast will have a poorly defined pitch. You want musical instruments, most musical instruments, they have to be able to go through their rhythmic motion many times without losing much energy. Otherwise, the pitch suffers. One of the ways in which musical instruments lose energy is by producing sound. And actually, the drum, as we'll see when we get to drums, drum loses energy so efficiently to sound in its main motion that it goes thunk, thunk. It's just a thunk sound because it just pumps the air beautifully and sends out all of its energy as sound in a couple cycles, and then it's done. All right? I think I've said everything I want to say for the world of springs. All right? So, ball sports, bouncing. When I first started talking about bouncing balls for this class many years ago, I thought at the time that balls are really spring-like, and it was completely natural to continue on. Balls, as I tried without perfect success to point out, a ball is not a one-dimensional thing that has a well-defined direction along which the bending or stretching occurs. It's a ball. It's a spherical, and so the distortion, the amount that you bend the surface away from its favorite position, it's not the force it pushes back with is not exactly proportional to how far you dent it. It's messier. So my motivation for going this direction is now lost in history because in my not knowing enough. But still, it's a very useful part of science of everyday life, knowing how balls work. And we'll come back to balls a second time to look at how they interact with the air, once we have some knowledge of how anything interacts with air. So start off neglecting the air. My opening question. Oh yeah, I'm still out of side camera. Where is this thing? Yeah, get whiplash just watching it. Okay. Okay, so first question here is, if you stack a tennis ball on a basketball and drop the pair on the ground, how high will a tennis ball bounce? And just to sort of, there was a tennis ball here. I didn't use the tennis ball. Doesn't matter, I can use a different ball. Baseball's dangerous. All right. Handball is somewhat bouncy. So you might expect that if I drop the pair together, the ball will end up about here. How many think that the tennis ball will bounce approximately to its original height? Like if I drop them from here, it'll come back to here. How many think that's where I can expect to find the ball? How many think that it will go much higher than that? Okay. How many think much less high? All right. In the new tradition of giving away the story initially, I gotta be come back here. I gotta not kill myself with this sucker. Ready? All right. You can imagine it's dangerous. What happened? Just to give away the story, when the ball bounces off a motionless surface like the floor, it doesn't bounce very well. Well, it starts with a certain amount of energy, actually, in this case, and it certainly can't go through some simple motion which doesn't involve doing any work on anything and go back up higher than it started, because that means summoning up energy out of nowhere. So it's got a certain amount of gravitational potential energy. There's nothing in the story that would give it more energy, so it can't go any higher than it started, and it doesn't even do that good, because some of its energy gets wasted as thermal energy. So you get a basic idea of why the ball can't come back to its original height or even. When it bounces off the basketball, though, it turns out the bounce finishes after the basketball bounces. So the basketball goes down, bounces, it's moving upward, and it hits the ball as the basketball is rising. The basketball bats the ball up in the air. It transfers, it does work and transfers momentum, work and impulse to this ball and pounds it up into the sky. So there's a transfer of energy from the basketball to the little ball. And that's ultimately the reason why the ball can go so high. Woo. All right. So the story, setting the stage for the story, bouncing balls, we'll start with us bouncing balls off of motionless, rigid surfaces that sort of are uninvolved in the story, except to allow the ball to bounce. And then we'll look at surfaces that are not so rigid, that actually can get involved in the bouncing process. And lastly, we'll get involved in surfaces that are not only not rigid, but they actually can move like a bat swung by someone. And in which case, the bounce is even more complicated and interesting. Hopefully all followable when I get it all done. So some observations about bouncing balls. Some balls bounce better than others. My tendency is to refer to a ball that bounces very well. That if you drop it from rest at this height, it hits a rigid surface like the floor, and it comes back almost to that height. I call that lively, a bouncy ball or a lively ball. In contrast, a ball that when you drop it from rest up here, it only comes up to about there. I would call that a relatively dead ball. Not much to it. Not a very bouncy ball. Okay? So a whole variety pack in the world of balls. Incidentally, a baseball, it's not a real, but here's a real one. Okay, a baseball is a pretty dead ball. I'll drop it from here. It only came up to, it didn't even make it to my knees. So it's a crummy, has a crummy bounce. A bouncy ball, it's coming up 70% of its original height, give or take, something like that. So there's a whole range. Balls bounce differently from different surfaces. The surface matters. If you drop a ball, I don't care how bouncy it is, nearly all balls will not bounce from sand. You take this, obviously this is a great bouncer. If I drop it on sand, thunk. So the surface that you bounce from matters. And bouncing off a moving surface, well, I just showed you with the basketball, which is ultimately a moving surface, makes a huge difference. But all the sports moving things, whether it's a baseball bat or a cricket bat, or I can't speak British, all right, or Australian, I don't know, whatever. The questions we'll go after. Why doesn't a ball rebound to its original height is the starting one. And that's an easy one. And that's, yeah. I will ask this question. But the easy one is it's an energy problem. The ball can't start at one height and bounce higher than that without getting energy from something. So I will ask this question: is when a bouncy ball, like the pink one there, bounces from a rigid floor, which object has significant work done on its surface? So my bouncy ball. So from the perspective of the floor, it's does the floor have work done in pushing its surface downward? And from the ball's perspective, does the ball have work done on its surface by pushing its surface inward towards its center during the collision? How many think that the only one with significant work done on its surface is the ball? How about the floor? How about both of them? Okay, there are a few people going for both of them. The answer is going to be the ball. The floor's problem is the floor is so rigid and immovable that when the ball hits it, it barely moves. And so, as always, for the ball to do work on the surface of the floor, the surface, it has to push on the floor, which it does, but the floor has to move a distance in the direction of that downward push. And the floor just won't do it. It's too rigid and too massive. Nothing much happens. So there's a tiny amount of work done on the floor. But for all practical purposes, the ball has its own surface invested with energy by the floor doing work on it. And why that's important is that at the moment of deepest impact, when the ball has dented as far as it's going to dent, the floor has dented what little it's going to dent, the ball's motionless. Its energy has gone from gravitational, when I let go of it, to kinetic, when it was moving very fast and about to hit the floor, to gone. Where'd the energy go? Right during the bounce. It has been invested into the ball's surface by denting the ball's surface. And the ball is a little bit spring-like. It's not literally a spring, because it violates Hooke's law. But it's spring-like. And stretched or bent or dented springs store energy. And the ball has been given this dose of energy equal to what it started with. So all of its gravitational potential energy became kinetic and has now been shoved into its surface by denting the surface. And the bounciness of the ball is going to depend on how well the ball can then return that energy and make it back into kinetic energy again. Some balls do a good job, some balls do a terrible job. And so on Friday, I'll walk through that rebounding, the impact and then the rebounding process.